I will turn it over to you, Peter. Thank you for being here with us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and good morning and happy Monday to everyone out there. I'm Peter Shaffert. I'm with Atkinson Andelson. I'm a partner in the Fresno office. It was 105 yesterday, and it was smoky, so it feels like home for Fresno in the summer. So if you're elsewhere out in the valley, I commiserate with you on the current conditions, but I'm sure at some point they will get better, and we can have a nice toasty September as we always typically do. So my specialty, I guess, for the last 2 years has been essentially all things COVID related. And I don't know if it's been completely 2 years. It feels like it's been 50 years, but that's where we are. And I've been assisting small school districts throughout California, answering questions about COVID. What do we bargain? How do we bargain? When do we bargain these things? Why does it matter, right? And trying to get us to navigate through so that we have a good result with our labor relations and with our labor partners, and bringing us all kind of to at least some semblance of functionality with respect to kind of the ever-changing orders and the collective bargaining process. I put this together because I wanted to have kind of a teaser for our larger negotiation series, and I hope if you get a chance and opportunity to take it, please do, because if you're new to bargaining, if you need refreshers, if you just got appointed as the bargaining chair, and want to work on some strategies and thoughts and how to really frame it out, it's the perfect program for you. I've got partners and colleagues that are taking different portions, and hopefully it gets you, kind of the full package with respect to how to bargain and the negotiations and bargaining process. Today, I'm really going to focus on, how the heck do we negotiate and run a small district when we have these ever-changing orders. I think the thing that's on everybody's minds right now, right, is the August 11 vaccine and testing mandate, right? So we're going to go through that, tips, some language tips, trends that I'm seeing, questions answered, hopefully more answered than questioned, but it all kind of depends on, what you need, what your bargaining groups are interested in, how hard there's posturing, things like that from the different groups. So all that kind of comes into play. So just real quick on the agenda today. So the first thing we're going to do, navigating the COVID-19 effects bargaining, and then also a little section on how to pandemic proof your MOUs, your memorandums of understanding with your bargaining units, also called collective bargaining agreements, or just the MOUs that you may have already agreed to regarding COVID-19. And then again, throughout, I really want to try to highlight some tips, some sample language, and then answer your questions on all things COVID-19 bargaining related. So fairly kind of short agenda, but trust me, there's plenty to talk about. And if you have any questions, you can shoot them in the chat. You can raise your hand and ask. You can interrupt me. It's all good with me. I think we all kind of collectively learn better from each other when we have these kinds of presentations. So if you have something that comes up and you're dying to ask, please do so. I might not get right to you if I'm in the middle of something, but especially if it's in the chat, I have to open it up, and then you'll see that weird, yellow square that comes up that says I'm doing something else, but I will get to it. And then Taylor, if I forget, you can always interrupt me as well, and we can get to your questions. So the first thing, did I hear a question? So the first thing, let's talk about effects bargaining. Effects bargaining is a little different than your kind of.
Hold on, this is Matt.
Well, I'm going to put.
Yes, sir. What can I do for you?
Thank you. I don't have the power to mute, but they figured it out. So again, effects bargaining, a little bit different than what we typically think of, as wages and hours and working conditions, right? So I just want to give a little bit of background when we're talking about bargaining and bargaining the effects of things. So Right now, as you know, there's the August 11th order that says implemented by October 15th, you have to have all your workers, which is your employees and other paid and unpaid people that are at the school site. And if you want a bigger definition of what worker means, it's essentially anybody that's volunteering, anybody that is being paid by the district to do work. Those are essentially our workers, right? And it technically means adults. So student workers, it's not exactly applicable to them. But in any event, so for our workers, by October 15th, we have to have our proof of vaccination. And there's various 6 things that they can show to demonstrate that they've been vaccinated. We have to keep records of it. If not, if they refuse to state, right, whatever it is, and we don't have proof of vaccination, then they have to go into the weekly testing. So we have an obligation, I guess we have an obligation to implement the health orders, and the district essentially has 2 choices, right? Implement the order or ignore the order and go about our business in another fashion. I haven't seen that second option play out very, very well for anyone yet. So we are all kind of looking at how do we do that. The next thing that comes up is, is there going to be a situation where we're going to have a mandated vaccination status? It's highly likely in this climate, especially when we have the FDA moving kind of more towards approving more of the COVID-19 vaccines. So that may be something on the horizon to expect. Then, of course, we have how do we implement our unvaccinated testing requirements? In addition to that, as you all may know, the supplemental paid sick leave is set to expire September 30th. So bargaining units and employees are really wondering, hey, are you guys going to give us something? Because September 30th may come and go, but I think COVID's here to stay. What happens when I get sick? So there's all these things that we have to consider, and some of them are, of course, going to be mandatory, wages and hours and working conditions and things like that. But things that aren't, right, like the decision to follow, for example, the health orders, that's a management decision. And so I wanted to kind of take a step back and go back and say, well, what do you mean management decision? What does that really mean? So when we're talking about management rights, it's really it's the essential driving of the district's business, right? We don't have to bargain over kind of our management rights. What we get to do that is not related directly necessarily to working conditions, hours of employment, salaries, that sort of thing. And so there is a management right? And we get to establish the amounts of service. We get to establish the nature of the work that people do. That's the extent of what services are provided. That's all definitely a management right. The decision to do it, totally definitely the management right to do that. And so the school districts, and I'll just use the vaccination and testing, management right to decide we're going to abide by the health orders, right? And there's nothing really negotiable about that decision, because that essentially is we're going to drive the district's business in that sense. And so just kind of some examples that are like outside of the mandatory bargaining scope. And you often see like the decision to lay off, for example, is going to be a management right. Of course, we all know then that the effects of that come into play. But again, like the level of service to be provided, where someone reports, assignment of duties that are already reasonably related to what someone's already doing. And I think we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as it applies to your health staff, if you have health staff, and how to implement the testing requirements. And is that something already reasonably related to their classification, or is it something new, right? Again, coming back to effects bargaining, that may be something that we have to bargain. Creating a position, abolishing a position. If you don't have health staff, maybe you're thinking of adding it. Right, and the decision to add it, may not necessarily be bargainable, but the job description, the salary, right, all of those things, again, would also be subject to that mandatory bargaining requirement for something that's within the scope of bargaining. And if it's not, right, if it's not one of the kind of traditional things, right, like your wages and hours and working conditions, there's a test for whether or not we would have a duty to bargain, right? And it's a 3-part test. And one of the things is, could whatever we're doing have an impact or a negative or positive or significant effect on one of our other working conditions, right? And so in the COVID world, health and safety working condition, right, that comes into play quite a lot. So we're left with the impact on safety of the health orders and the decision or how we implement it and what it looks like. So that's part and parcel kind of an impact or effect on working conditions that the health orders have. The next question is, so I would say, yes, we have a potential impact on working conditions. So we go to step 2, right? Does the action arise from making a fundamental managerial decision? Fundamental managerial decision would be whether or not we're going to follow. We say yes, then we don't just have to meet and confer, but then we have to apply a balancing test, which is basically, does our need to make a decision outweigh the benefit for a bargaining unit to basically hash out the details through bargaining? And the answer almost unequivocally under the EERA is, in general, any effect that is going to be directly on working conditions is going to essentially require us to have a duty to bargain. I say that broadly because there are certain things that for example, like if there's an imminent emergency, for example, there's certain emergency things that we can do without having to bargain anything. I wouldn't say they're necessarily applicable in the COVID context, but wildfires may be an emergency situation that you deal with, things like that. Earthquakes, heaven forbid we haven't had in a while. But that type of stuff is going to be able to be implemented immediately. Again, emergency exception is not the general rule. However, bargaining is one of the things that you're going to have to do, especially when it relates, I think, to a lot of the COVID-related things that we have to do as employers. So there's a duty to bargain over the foreseeable impacts or effects, even of a non-negotiable decision. But I want to just highlight this kind of as the most important thing is you have to do it before you implement the decision. And so that's kind of the key piece here is, remember, you have to bargain before you implement something that has an effect, an impact, a change to the working conditions, or that is foreseeably likely to result in a change in some kind of working condition, or could have an effect, right? So that's just kind of the general there. And so if you don't give notice and an opportunity to negotiate prior to when you implement something, then that could, this is the kind of the quote, but essentially what that means is we have an obligation to give a notice, an opportunity to bargain before we implement something. So let's say, for example, we're going to implement the vaccine, essentially the vaccination health order with the testing. And we say, okay, if you don't get tested, then we're going to discipline you because you refuse to test. Well, did we give our bargaining units notice and an opportunity to bargain before we did that? If we didn't, then they could bring a unfair labor practice charge because it would violate the EERA because we implemented something that would have a foreseeable effect on our employees without giving that notice and opportunity to bargain, right? So and the question is, if you're not clear on whether or not you have a duty to bargain, then the fail-safe position is to say, okay, union, we all know we got to do this. This is what we're planning to do. Let us know if you'd like. Let us know if you'd like to bargain. Here's some dates. That kind of puts you on the up and up in a sense. The other thing also is, even if some of this isn't bargainable, right? Maybe it's simply the management's right or the district's right to do something. It doesn't necessarily mean that you do it without discussing things with your bargaining units, because at the end of the day, it's like a marriage. They're always there with you, and even you're really kind of setting up a relationship where you want to be able to work together constructively as opposed to butting heads. And so it's also one of those things. It's like a marriage, except there is no divorce possibility, right? Because your labor representatives and your labor are kind of fundamentally connected with you. You could have the same employees for 25, 30 years, right? And so for that reason, I often talk to my bargaining teams about the importance of working with your units constructively, so that we have a good relationship, so that when things come up, that there's a certain trust level, and every scenario is a little bit different. Sometimes you have great labor relations, sometimes not so much, but one of the things that you can work towards in gaining that trust and getting to kind of a better position with your units, again, is that notice and an opportunity, that heads up, which I find to be very constructive in a lot of ways. So even if it's something where I think we don't really need to bargain it, but giving that ahead of time discussion can really help improve relations, and at least build a little trust that you're going to give them the opportunity under the law that they're entitled to. So if you don't, right, then what happens is the bargaining unit could file what they call an unfair labor practice charge, which basically says, hey, you violated the obligation to give notice and an opportunity to bargain. You didn't do that, so we're going to file with the Public Employment Relations Board. They'll go through the process, and it involves a hearing and all those things. And the worst kind of result, right, is that PERB could say, okay, you have to go back to the status quo prior to when you implemented that decision and bargain it out. So the consequences too, especially kind of in the COVID environment, is, well, if you didn't negotiate the process by which you're going to implement the vaccine and testing, that means that we got to go back to status quo where there wasn't any consequences, say, for example, for refusing to test, or the accommodations process, maybe for people that have a medical excuse from wearing a mask or testing or things like that. You're gonna have to go back to the status quo and bargain it out. Yeah, that's kind of when it's not something monetary, right? Like someone losing hours or someone not getting a promotion or things like that. It really kind of is a procedural issue that forces us to go back to what the rule was before we changed it and negotiate a new set of rules for implementation. The burden used to be on the unions to identify when there is some specific impact or effect. And over the years, that obligation has really shifted and moved onto the districts and the employer. And so management now essentially bears the responsibility on identifying when there could be an actual change or an impact and effect on bargaining unit members. And then we have the obligation to notify the union, provide an opportunity to participate, and again, that affects bargaining. So even though it's not necessarily something that we're doing on someone's hours, the effect that it could generally have, again, going to be something that we need to bargain with them, or at least give notice and opportunity. Now, sometimes it happens that we give them notice and we don't hear anything back, or they say, no, that's fine. When that happens, and it hasn't happened a lot with COVID, but it has, when that happens, that essentially means that the unit is waiving its right to bargain. So you gave a notice and opportunity, they didn't want to bargain, or they said they were good with whatever you had identified as the district's procedure for implementing something. That congratulations, that means you can go to the next process of actually trying to run the school district and getting through that bargaining. Like I said, I haven't had that happen very often, and I don't know if you've gotten them, but I've gotten from CSEA and from the teachers unions demands to bargain essentially anytime there's a change in the health orders. And so even if I don't get that, when I'm implementing them, then I also recommend to my districts, hey, time to give notice, an opportunity to bargain. We'll set some dates and we'll go from there. So I think this is just another consequence slide. So that kind of, again, just the bringing you back to status quo. That's the essential consequences. So no deal there. And again, I think I already talked about this, but they have the obligation to demand to bargain once we've given notice, right? And so here's the thing. What happens when we don't agree on whether something is an effect and whether we have to negotiate the effects? If there's any doubt, right, then if we just refuse and say it's not bargainable and they disagree, well, then we just essentially committed an unfair labor practice. So the key here is when in doubt, bargain it out. Which is not always the most pleasant experience, but you know, the consequences are that you have the unfair labor practices. You can it can give a lot of I guess momentum for the union to rally against things that you may want to do, or specific employees that they may not get along with very well, and so that kind of ramp up is something that kind of puts pressure on the labor relationship, and can make coming to an agreement more difficult. So you know, while you know, the unfair labor practice decision may be kind of a slap on the hand or something that says don't do that, the consequences are greater in the sense of what it does to the relationship between you and your bargaining unit. So that's kind of the situation when when the parties can't agree on whether or not something is negotiable. It turns out to be, if you can't agree, then let's just go ahead and give notice an opportunity and bargain, and that makes the process a little more simple. So after all that, and then let's say you get to an agreement, or they waive, or you go through an unfair labor practice, get a decision, and then bargain, and then finally, at the end of the day, you can push the button and shoot your implementation rocket up, and you're off to the races. So there's a timing aspect to it too, right? In general, you have to kind of in regular bargaining, for example, where you're bargaining the reopener for one of your units, the decision cannot be implemented until essentially you've either reached an agreement, or you've gone through impasse and fact-finding and post-fact-finding negotiations, and then you unilaterally implement, which is way far down the line. And of course, at that point, if you can unilaterally implement, then the union also has the opportunity to strike, which is never a position that's very, very comfortable either. But that's kind of the typical process, right? We come to an agreement, we then get to implement. And if you don't agree and implement something prior, that's called a unilateral change, and that is something that they can bring to PERB as an unfair labor practice. There's exceptions, though, to that general rule. And one of them is where we find ourselves with COVID regularly, and that is that we have a deadline to comply, right? We have to comply by October 15th. Or else, we can be in trouble with not only the health order, but potential risks to health and safety, potential liability for failing to comply. And so there is an external deadline that is kind of imposed on us, right? And so when we have that, the exception allows us to implement if we give advance notice, sufficient advance notice to give them an opportunity to bargain prior. And then we continue to negotiate even after we have to implement. So here's the thing. We don't necessarily have a hard and fast October 15th deadline to get our bargaining done. We have that deadline to implement. And so we could utilize this exception to implement prior to reaching a negotiated agreement, because we have an obligation to do it that's an enforced hard deadline. I just say this means that we don't need to rush to the table necessarily to get this done. I think it's good if you are, and I'm doing that, all over California. But it kind of relieves the pressure of, having to meet this hard and fast deadline, because sometimes we're just not going to agree. And it's going to take some time at the table, or some time for people to feel things out, time for health orders to change, which is highly likely, given the scenario. It feels like there's something changing daily, right? And so maybe that's what we need to change before we can get a bargaining unit into agreement. So all those things can happen, right? But at least with this exception that we can utilize, it means as long as we gave an opportunity to bargain beforehand and we bargained, and then we had to implement, as long as we continue to bargain, it's not an unfair labor practice. So I've utilized that a lot in the last year and a half, whatever it is, and to good results, because number one, we meet the requirements of the health orders, but number two, we get the time to get with our bargaining units and make sure we come to an agreement that we may not like, but we can ultimately live with. Which again is something that there's a lot of moving parts to the COVID environment, and a lot of them, of course, bargainable, which means compromise is sometimes something that we just have to do, and a compromise result better than no agreement. So that's also a thing that we'll talk about, is where are some gives that I've seen districts do with respect to getting a deal on COVID-19 impacts, what those look like. And then if any of you have any thoughts or ideas, I'd love to hear them as well, because I've seen quite a lot. And essentially, the COVID-19 MOUs that we saw all over had, a lot of one-time monies, right, that we all utilized for kind of acknowledging the difficulty of working in the COVID environment for our classified and certificated staff and administrative staff as well. But that's not the only way that you can kind of incentivize, the agreements with the unions. So, well, that's a lot to go through, right? And if your head's spinning a little bit, you're like, oh my gosh, how many bargaining effects do I have to do? Just remember, at the end of the day, we're really looking at, vaccination and testing, right? That's kind of the meat and potatoes of the current health order. And so one of the things that I've seen, the question I've got a lot, right, is can we mandate that employees receive a COVID vaccine, right? And the answer, of course, would be yes. But, right, the effect of implementing a vaccine mandate at a minimum is going to be negotiable, and the health and safety component of it as well. I think that's going to be a mandatory subject of bargaining in my mind, right? And so that brings into play what kinds of accommodation issues that we have. And I think the EEOC has put out a pretty good explanation as to what kind of the requirements are. And so essentially, you can have a vaccine mandate. However, you have to implement two things, and there's reasonable accommodations, right, for a medical or religious exemption from receiving the vaccine. And so that can take a lot of forms, right? Essentially, it puts you into kind of this interactive process with the employee. What accommodations can we provide for the medical exemption? What about for the religious exemption? And so with the vaccine, I think really, are there alternatives to a vaccine that we can do? And we know one of them right now, of course, is that they submit to weekly testing. There's going to be additional mask and face covering components that they have to do, right, when students aren't present and they're indoors and that sort of thing. One of the questions too is, if we do, what does it look like for our employees? What if someone refuses to get vaccinated based on something other than a religious or medical accommodation? And the answer is, if you're going to implement disciplinary action, well, then the union's going to want to know, well, wait a minute, that's not really currently a cause for disciplinary action in the classified service. And you say, well, yes, it is. It's a directive. They failed to follow the directive, and now we're going to discipline, right? But again, that brings into the table, right, the bargaining obligation. So you can't just do it without going through the notice and opportunity to bargain, which they will. And hashing out what that looks like. Maybe it's not necessarily a right off the bat kind of disciplinary and for a termination, right? For example, that's a pretty extreme deal. But I've had a lot of districts say, well, hey, if someone refuses to test or refuses to vaccinate, can't we just tell them to go home and go home without pay until they agree? And I think, well, that's a little bit risky because number one, most of your employees are going to be permanent employees who have a due process right in a property interest in their job. All right. And so doing that without going through the disciplinary action process could potentially put you at risk of them saying, hey, you deprived me of my property right in my job without due process. Right. So one of the things that I've worked on for some districts is kind of this truncated disciplinary process for people refusing to test or people for refusing to vaccinate, depending on what the decision of the district is on that issue. There could also be liability issues. Let's say, for example, we decide that we're not going to follow the masking rules. We're going to let individuals just decide whether they're going to wear a mask or not. That could be a potential issue for liability in the sense of if someone gets sick because we didn't implement a health order, does that what does that look like for us? And also kind of the logistics of it. And let's talk about kind of the logistics of testing, right? I know a lot of you don't really have health staff. So one of the issues is, well, who's going to be your tester? Who's going to be your record keeper of all the testing results and all that? And so that's a logistical issue that a lot of folks haven't solved yet. Some of them can rely on administration to do that, but again, and not everyone is going to be necessarily thrilled about processing tests and swabbing noses and all that stuff. So again, that's another consideration when we're talking about testing and how to do that. I did talk briefly about, what the EEOC exceptions require. And so some of them, right, and the medical one, which most often comes up is remote work, right? And currently it's very difficult, I think, for remote work, especially for our certificated staff, because distance learning is a thing of the past, theoretically, right? We'll talk about independent study as well, and bargaining independent study, just to give you guys something to take away for that as well. But so distance learning's gone, and now we have to implement something, right? And so is it possible for a teacher to do remote work? Maybe if they're running the independent study program, right? But not for everyone else. So does it make sense? Is that a possibility for someone with a multiple subject credential, for example, when you have a K through 8 where maybe the specific subjects have to be taught and you can't necessarily use a single subject teacher? Or what if you have a specialized credential and they're requesting the accommodation and you can't necessarily have all your students doing that through independent study, of course, either, right? So that kind of plays itself out in the accommodations world. Sometimes there's modified reduced work schedules. There's all kinds of physical accommodations that we can make and spatial arrangements and things like that. But again, when it comes to medical exemptions or medical, the interactive process, it's largely driven by, what kind of notes we get back from the doctor on that. So there's a lot of those things that come into play before something like, termination is an option. One of the easiest accommodations, although of course disfavored by the employee, is an unpaid leave of absence, right? That's always an accommodation that the district could offer. It still requires use of a sub, but that is something that's out there and that has been used pretty frequently for positions where you just can't have somebody working remote. You just can't have somebody with, all these other kind of restrictions that makes it an undue burden on the employer to do. Small school districts, so there's a saving grace for you to some degree, and that is because you are, smaller school districts. Having people not be able to be present on site can create an undue hardship to a greater extent than larger school districts. So there is kind of that benefit in the sense of being in the small school district world, that the burden, I guess, of showing the cost or expense or difficulty that it creates for remote work. You guys are have a lot more. There's a lot lower, I guess, a lower barrier to demonstrate than you would if you had, a larger group of a larger staff in a bigger school district. The religious exemption, I just want to go through. I know this was talking about kind of the interactive process. We talked about it for the medical. What about the religious, right? So it's a similar interactive process, but again, we have to look at what that employee is essentially requesting. Is it an exemption from the vaccine? I think we've already got that covered. They can be tested, do the masking thing. I've gotten also quite a bit of the inability or the religious belief that makes it impossible for someone to do testing. That's come up pretty consistently. And then we also have the religious exemption. People are saying that they have a strongly held religious belief about wearing a mask. And so either of those, the religious belief against testing, the religious belief against masking, requires us to do the same kind of interactive process that we would, but the undue burden test is fairly quickly met in the situation, especially with the testing, right? Because that means that, the person could be potentially risking health and safety of others in the workplace by granting an accommodation that would not require them to test. I have written several kind of letters to the people who've requested that exemption, telling them no and the reasons why. And I haven't had, knock on wood yet, I haven't had anyone push back and say, it's not an undue burden because there's these things that you could do to implement. None of them really work, right? Because a lot of folks can't do remote work and they don't want to take an unpaid leave of absence. So that's kind of where we are with that. With the masking, again, I think it's the same kind of deal. And we go through the process. Is there the religiously held belief that you can't wear a mask because of X, Y, or Z? As long as they have a quote unquote sincerely held religious belief, and I think it's not something that requires that they're the 10 tenets of faith, and one of them is we cannot be tested, right? It just essentially has to be a religious belief that person sincerely holds, requires us to go through this process. So that bar for the employee is fairly low as well. The reason I get all into this is because if your bargaining unit says, hey, we need to bargain on the effects of your decision to implement, one of the things that's going to come up is, well, what about religious and medical exemptions from testing or face coverings or vaccination status? So I just wanted to give you all kind of the range of options that you could be looking at when that happens, so that you have kind of a series of things to think about and what it looks like when you get to the table with your units. So I think we already kind of went through the undue hardship for religious exemption. And if you have an objective basis for questioning someone's sincerely held religious belief, you can request supporting information to back that up. But I would be very careful when you do that because you don't really get to question. They don't have to show much of anything to establish that they have a religious, belief that prevents them from doing one or that requires an exemption from the standard rule that the district wants to implement. So just be aware of that. It's not something that I would really push on And if they've gone to the extra added work of finding, some kind of biblical reference or something like that that they base their religious belief on, I think that's probably more than is even required with respect to that. So just be careful out there when asking for additional support as to why this is a sincerely held religious belief. If they just don't believe, for example, that masking is effective, that's not a religious belief, right? That's scientific or not, that's not really religion based. So if it's that, we don't grant exemptions for that. So just want to make sure that I'm clear on that one. So let's take testing, slow down a little bit, and talk about, when you're at the table, what are some of the things that are going to come up, right? Who's going to be responsible for administering the tests? What kind of PPE are they going to get? Are they going to get N95s? Because I get that question a lot. Are they going to have to wear gowns? Are they going to have to receive special training to do the testing? And, I've tested my kids with the Binax, 15-minute or less test, and it's not, it's not rocket surgery, and we can definitely train folks. And again, this is another benefit of being a small school district is maybe you could probably have your existing staff do that. So here's where it gets kind of hinky, right? Is there's the employee testing, but then there's also testing for students under the modified quarantine rules. Again, something that you might have to bargain if your focus is to have someone in the bargaining unit, right, administer the testing, keeping the records that we have to for the state on all of that. So one of the other things too that comes up is, well, hey, if I have to do all this additional work, I think you should pay me. Right? Because maybe your health staff haven't necessarily had to do anything to this degree before, and it is quite new. The other thing that comes up a lot too is, well, wait a minute, I don't have the staff to do this. Can't I find a third-party vendor to come in and once a week come in and do all the testing that we have to do? And the answer is, well, maybe. Right? If this is really new work that's unlike anything that's your employees have ever done before, right? Then maybe that is a justification. We can say, look, this isn't.
It's Julia. How are you?
Oh.
I am good.
Oh, got you muted. So we go back and lost my train of thought, but it'll come back to me. It's something that they've never done before. It's different than, let's say, your health aide, is dealing with, cuts and bruises and record keeping or something like that. Or that's your nurse's purview, and they don't do testing like this. Maybe that's a justification to say, hey, look, this really isn't reasonably related to what you normally do as an employee for us. So we're going to contract that out. Again, my sense of it is give notice and opportunity if that is something that looks like bargaining unit work. And that way they can say, hey, that's our job. I haven't had anyone want to do that yet, but maybe they do because they want money in exchange for it. And so that's one of the things, right? You're going to provide a stipend for the testers, right? And what does that look like? The other thing is do you need just somebody one day a week to do the testing? You have to stagger it, right? Because there's so many people that you have to test. I know in some areas you're going to have lots of people get vaccinated, and there's just a handful of people that have to test every week. You could be in another situation where there's a lot of people to test because very few people got the vaccine. I would say on average about between 50 and 70% of staff that from the numbers that I've gotten from districts have already been vaccinated. So worst case scenario, half your staff once a week. And you have to figure that out, especially where here's the other problem, right? What if the person that you're going to do the testing is at one site and you have 3 sites? Are you going to have your employees travel to that site to get tested? Does that make a lot of sense, health and safety wise? Or should your tester, rotate between locations to make sure that they get the staff tested? So reason for that is one of the things that the union is going to request is reasonable release time for their employees to travel, to and from locations if they have to do the testing. The other thing is, like we talked about, what happens when when an employee refuses to test. So if an employee refuses to test, what are we going to do? Are we going to instruct them to go home, or are we going to leave them on site and let them go about their merry way? Are we going to, go through and start with the kind of truncated disciplinary process, or have they, is there an exemption? But like we already kind of talked about, that they are requesting from the testing, which we really don't have right now because it's a mandate. But again, all those things come into play. And of course, one of the most common things that the unions will ask for is, well, then can't I get some extra compensation for, the travel time or the hassle of having to do the test? And I've said no on that. But for when someone is kind of going above and beyond what they normally do, and you've got that person that will do the testing and that is comfortable with it, then, maybe a stipend is warranted for that. Especially if it's cheaper than contracting something out. So that is something that can be in play as well when you're talking about this with your units. And so I gave some health staff sample language. And Taylor, remind me, I didn't email this out to everybody, the PowerPoint. So at the end of the day, if you give your email to Taylor, or Taylor already has it, she'll give it to me, and I can blast it out to you, so you have kind of sample language that I've proposed to unions and this one is just actually the responsibility for testing, right? And so this is the language that I've proposed, and this would be for whoever's doing that. And I just call it health staff. If you don't have health staff, maybe it's someone in your bargaining unit, your classified bargaining unit, who's willing to be trained up to do all this stuff. Once you see kind of the requirements that we would be requesting from this person, you kind of start realizing, hey, maybe they should get more pay for the hassle that they're going to have to go through with respect to doing all of this work, right? And so that's, when you start considering, what's an appropriate compensation amount for them. Is it extra release? Is it extra, comp time or something like that? That's all, well negotiable, right? And if admin staff, you're going to do this, well, then I guess this would give you a plan for kind of what the things you need to cover for, even when it's not bargainable, the kinds of things that you're going to need to have in place and what you're going to need to do. And so I gave that to you there. So hopefully that gives you some, just an example of, the types of language that is being kind of passed back and forth between districts and bargaining units on who's responsible for the testing. And so again, this is kind of a truncated version of a COVID-19 MOU that I've been working on for various districts throughout California. And it really just kind of applies the bare bones, right? Whenever there's a vaccination and testing requirement, we're going to comply with it. So the benefit of that language is, let's say the mandates change and you don't have to test weekly anymore, right? And if we put weekly in here now, we got to change it, right? So maybe, maybe we say, okay, testing will be during the bargaining, or required testing will be during the bargaining unit members' regular work shift. I don't see weekly testing is going anywhere for this year. I guess by November we'll find out, but it's almost September now. And it doesn't look like things are getting that much better. Who knows, right? It could be just the way things are reporting. It could change over time. We don't know. And so, maybe we revise that language. But I feel comfortable with weekly testing is probably going to be the deal. But if you're worried, take that out and just say the required testing will be during bargaining unit members' regular work shift. So if it goes to testing every 2 weeks or testing once a month or whatever, you've got that. And on the first bullet, if the governor or the legislature, right, imposes a vaccination requirement, we don't have to go back and bargain this, because it just says we're going to comply. And the union, the district and the bargaining unit agreed, and we don't have to go back to the table again when the health order changes. Again, talking about costing. So what you want to do too is if you're going to have no cost testing for required testing, I say, hey, make sure that it's during the employee's regular workday. Otherwise, they could say, well, hey, I went and got tested after work. You owe me for all the time that I had to go spend sitting there waiting for the test to come out. Oh, and by the way, I didn't want to go get tested at a public facility, so I spent the $25 and bought the Binax test, and here's my negative test result. Is that? I don't think that's really how we want to necessarily do it. So having people test during their regular workday, that gives us the ability, number one, to maintain to reduce cost for our employees and the district for having to provide the testing, but also so we don't have that scenario where someone gives you that weird lollipop, testing strip result as evidence that they're negative, right? Because number one, we don't know if it's really theirs. Number two, we don't know when they actually took it. So there's all those considerations to think about, right? And I just have this language on the bottom there. That's kind of the consequence, right? If you, oops, sorry. There we go. So that's the consequence, that last bullet, that we're putting everyone on notice, right? That if you refuse test, that you're going to be subject to appropriate disciplinary action. Again, maybe you have a truncated process so you can get someone on an unpaid suspension quickly so that they're not kind of out in limbo with respect to, they're refusing to test. But I suspect you're not going to get that many people. I don't know. I guess it depends on how, how strong the individuals in your district are with respect to not wanting to get tested. So face coverings, I haven't talked a lot about that, but again, face covering, it's a requirement, right? When you're indoors, right, by all people. And so that's the current, and so this was just kind of draft language that we put together. And we're going to, you kind of limit it, right? In the sense that the language says, look, we're going to comply with whatever the rules are in our COVID-19 safety plan and whatever orders and guidance are from state and local health authorities. I've stayed away from referencing the CDC, and the reasoning for that is the public health department and the California Department of Public Health are really the ones who call the shots to a large degree on mandates. I haven't really seen mandates from the CDC. So if they do, maybe we would modify that. But, the boots on the ground are really your local public health authority. And so that's why I reference that. And just in case we'd all forgotten, do you remember when we had to put together our COVID safety plan, which comprised, two components, right? It was the COVID-19 prevention plan that Cal OSHA required, and then the guideline checklist that the CDPH put out that we had to comply with. And so that may need to be updated because we have kind of a change in, the health orders. So I've revised that for a lot of my districts. Just be aware that you probably should update it now. I think that August 11th guidance is going to stay good at least until November, unless they modify it another way. But, just when we've had significant changes like that, it may be something you want to go back and do. N95s. So some units have asked for N95s, and the Cal OSHA rules right now are that only unvaccinated employees who request N95s is a district required to get them. So that's where I kind of lead that discussion. Maybe there's scenarios, right, where an N95 is more appropriate. Let's say for health staff or whatever staff is going to be the person who is in the isolation room, right, with someone who may be sick waiting to go home. Maybe that's an appropriate person who gets an N95. I don't know. And I don't know for you how available N95s are. So that's another consideration. If you've got a stockpile, is it going to put you out to do that? I mean, I don't know. Again, the religious accommodation, we've kind of gone through that. Then the worst of it all is what happens when we have conflicting orders and guidance, right? The CDC says one thing, the Department of Public Health says another, and then your local health department could be, in between the extremes. I've seen it every way. So what happens then? What I typically do is I go back and look at who's the boots on the ground. And so I say, general rule of thumb, comply with your local health department first. And then, go from there. I think that's kind of the safer bet with respect to when we have conflicting guidance. And that's something that often comes up in the language that gets passed back and forth between districts and the unions is, if there's a conflict, the most restrictive, the district will comply with the most restrictive, health and safety orders. I've tried to stay away from that because who knows what the conflicting languages will be. Who knows how your board is going to feel about it if we decide if we take that tack. So that's one of the considerations that I often think about when we're talking about those things. So, and what about compliance with further governmental orders? So this was something that I put into a lot of my agreements, which basically just gives us kind of a reopening, right? So if something changes and we have to comply with it, then we can bargain as needed. We don't have to do the notice and opportunity, blah, blah, blah. We already have an agreement that it came up, let's bargain it out. And that way we don't have to necessarily, we know what we're supposed to do when the health order changes, right? We've already kind of set the tone for us. Again, it keeps the door open to negotiate the changes. And so it's on our kind of radar to do that when that happens. Is there a question in the chat? Okay, so I've heard that surveillance testing will not be covered by insurance companies, only diagnostic testing. That's a good question. I will tell you that the CDPH and the CDE have come out and said, well, you guys have lots of that COVID money. You can use that to cover the cost of testing. It doesn't surprise me that insurance companies would say, hey, this is surveillance testing, not necessarily, symptom-based testing. And so I could see that as a rationale for why the insurance companies wouldn't allow that. Again, I think the CDE and the CDPH will just tell you, hey, you've got the money, so you can use that to cover the costs. I'll tell you this too, which is kind of an unfortunate thing. The Binax manufacturer is having shortages and difficulties in their manufacturing process. So you may not be able to even get tests. I don't even know what we do in that scenario, but that is a reality. I had one district who had the ability, I think, to buy about 4 weeks of testing based on the number of unvaccinated employees they had, and they hadn't even factored in the cost of testing for the modified quarantine for students. So that is out there as well, just to make you all feel super comfortable and happy on Monday. That's also kind of in flux. So there's also quarantine procedures and leaves, right? And so let's say that, there's I call it the Cal OSHA leave because I think it's the easiest way to talk about it, right? If COVID's acquired at work or it's a close contact at work, then the employee is entitled to what I call the Cal OSHA leave. And that means that generally they get, all the pay and the benefits and things for being out due to COVID. And there's language in the Cal OSHA rules that say an employer may deduct sick leave. They may deduct sick leave, but guess what? That means it's negotiable. And I have yet to have a single bargaining unit agree that, oh yeah, well, when I get sick at work, when I get COVID at work, I agree to have my personal sick leave bag deducted. The legislature came in and did the supplemental paid sick leave, which covered a lot of the deal, but the problem is it's only 80 hours and it expires on September 30th. So a lot of our bargaining units are saying, hey, provide us additional COVID leave because that's going to expire. And their concern is, well, look, if the legislature doesn't grant an extension of the SPSL, then I'm going to have to dip into my personal sick leave bank for COVID-related absences that are going to occur. My position has been, let's wait and see. Right? Because my guess is about September 15th or so, there's going to be an extension of the SPSL or a granting of a new period of 80 hours. I think that's probably what will happen. My crystal ball doesn't always work. It's been pretty good the last couple of months. So I'm guessing that that's going to be the deal. So I've held out on granting additional COVID leave, in the event that expires. If it does expire, I think that's something that's definitely going to be a discussion point at the table. The question there is, how much is it going to cost us, right? And there's a bit of a disconnect, and I might get on my soapbox a little bit right now with respect to how the rules have been implemented. Right, there's a disconnect between the amount of money that districts have gotten to cover, the impacts of COVID, right, with the CARES Act and the ESSER funding and all that. I get that. The problem is that we have a lot of students that get quarantined for which we will not get ADA apportionment. Now you can go and quickly get them signed up for an independent study agreement, and that can satisfy the requirement and get the ADA while the student is out for 10 days, right? And you have to do the independent study agreement with all the components of it, right? In the law with respect to when it goes beyond 15 days. But if you don't do that for your quarantine students, those are excused absences, but they don't count for apportionment. So if you're having significant numbers of students that are out, be aware of that, because you may be using that COVID money just to run your standard operating costs. And so that is a reality that I just want everyone to be aware of, unless and until, and I've heard through the grapevine that may change, and that you may be able to do an independent study for your quarantined students without having to go through the rigmarole process of the agreement and all that, but I haven't seen it in writing yet. A question out there. Would it be appropriate to offer additional leave to vaccinated employees but not unvaccinated? I have had that question raised, and I'll tell you this. I drafted the language, but I haven't proposed it to the union yet because I'm still thinking through, is that religious or disability-based discrimination if you're giving a benefit to vaccinated employees compared to those who can't get vaccinated. Now, I would say if you put in, a religious and medical exemption from vaccination, and maybe they got the leave too, then maybe we've eliminated that risk. But that is something that districts are looking at as kind of a carrot, right, to have people go get vaccinated, or at least to reward those that did go get vaccinated with additional leave. I'll tell you, the problem is your absences are all going to be the unvaccinated people, or a large degree of them will be the unvaccinated people. So your bargaining unit is going to say that really doesn't make any sense. But I get it. It's kind of a non-monetary benefit that you can provide to your certificate, to your vaccinated folks, that at least keeps it off of one-time payments and all that stuff again, right? But a good question. I'm not sure if I'm totally sold on whether it is or is not religious or disability-based discrimination if you do, additional leave for the vaccinated. I think you could probably get away with it, but I haven't really done, the deep research on it yet. So the jury's still out on that one. So just be aware that could be a potential pitfall. And if you want to move forward with it, then maybe you put in something about that leave gets provided to those who can't get vaccinated for, the two reasons. I did talk briefly about there's some things that we need to think about with independent study, because I've had a lot of teachers say, hold on, I didn't anticipate that this year, half of my students would be going in and out of independent study if we want to get ADA. And this is a lot of work. And we can't do virtual learning. I say that like that. So how do I manage this, right? And so for teachers, there's a lot of options that I've worked on. Teachers can do independent study, right, and be responsible for the independent study like they always have. Teachers are going to say, well, it's going to be a lot of work, and plus, it's sporadic and it takes additional time. One of the things is I call it simultaneous teaching, but it's basically like broadcasting, right? Like you have students in the class and then you have the students that are out due to quarantine at home, and you can do the independent study agreements, have the kids at home attend virtually, right? You can still do it if you have an independent study agreement and you meet the weekly, daily, or whatever the interaction requirements are. And so you could do it that way. And give yourself the opportunity to get the ADA through independent study. However, what if you're a district that has, like 3 kids that want to do independent study and everybody else wants to come in, and you can't dedicate a staff member to do independent study? Is that something that an additional responsibility that a teacher takes on, above and beyond what they normally do, because it may not necessarily wouldn't necessarily be their student? That may be something that we say, okay, that's an additional independent study responsibility you have. Maybe that's an appropriate for a stipend. It's like an independent study stipend. I have districts that are doing independent study simultaneous teaching stipends, right, where there's a certain amount per day that they get for providing that kind of virtual and in-person instruction at the same time. So there's lots of ways to kind of negotiate through the impacts of that with your certificated units. And I want to just give that to you guys as something to think about if you're struggling with your units and how to meet the needs of the students who are most definitely going to be out due to close contact quarantining. I know that, my own kids, especially in high school, I'm a high schooler, there's a lot of kids that are out in her classes, and it only takes one kid and like half the class is gone, right? And then that kid may have gone through, 6 different classes. And so there's just pockets of kids all the way through that makes it difficult. So not as bad, like I said, in the elementary and middles, but still potentially an issue there. So that's kind of what I've got for independent study. And I really haven't seen kind of any other iterations that are out there, but that's kind of what I've got. So I did want to talk about, we have an existing bargaining agreements that have all kinds of stuff in there. And so one of the things that we may want to think about is putting in some language to deal with pandemics in contracts, traditional contracts. They call it the force majeure clause, right? And the force majeure, it just meant if there's some kind of act of God, right, that requires us to do something different, or that ruins the ability, or the ruin. Oh. Or there's something that causes us not to be able to complete the terms of the contract, that, the contract is void or blah, blah, blah. That's the force majeure clause. I'm thinking about adding something like that to my CBAs, just so that we have a process for, when something happens, what do the parties do? And the parties have already agreed to it and it's already there. So that could be a way to help kind of delineate a process, right? And that, we're going to follow the CBA unless it conflicts, right, with, some health order that we have to comply with, or, some emergency situation where, we can't do X, Y, or Z. So that we agree kind of a process ahead of time so that we know what each side is going to expect to do. I will say this, if you're going to do it, we want to kind of put in as much flexibility as we can. Maybe you put in stuff about, the parties agree that the district will, do its best to notify the bargaining unit and give it an opportunity to bargain if it can. Yeah, and if not, I'll notify them that they're implementing it or whatever, and just give yourself the most flexibility with respect to that. And I think some of the sample language that I had up in front about giving yourself the opportunity to say, look, if the health orders change, we're going to come back together and work on, on what that looks like. That may be something that you intersperse into your MOUs so that at least you have something there that gets you to the table, that's already agreed to by each side. And it doesn't really have to necessarily be formal negotiations. Maybe it's a meet and confirm. Maybe it's, there's a lot that you could do that doesn't necessarily require you to hit back to the table every time. But I will say this, that seems to be the place that we're going with a lot of this. So, don't be surprised if you're spending a whole lot more time at the bargaining table than you did previously. I know it's uncomfortable sometimes. I know sometimes it feels like it's inefficient, and you have other things. You definitely have other things to do, but it's an important component of complying with the law. It's an important component for working with your labor representatives and your employees and your staff, and building that trust. So it is a necessary process that we have to get through, and I think it's something that you should spend time to do, especially if you're in a situation where you don't have the greatest relationship with your union, because I know that happens, and I know it happens frequently. So maybe there's reopeners in there that say, look, if a health order triggers, maybe we reopen and we start bargaining on certain dates or subjects. Maybe there's, if there's changes in legislation, that we go back to the table, or if there's changes in legislation, we agree that the district will comply with it, right? And maybe that's enough, but I give you those kind of little tidbits as food for thought as to how you can do that, so you don't necessarily have to keep coming back. If the parties have agreed that you're going to comply, then you just say, hey, we're going to comply, and this is how we're going to do it. Maybe that language is sufficient to have already bound them. Of course, the union can say, well, there's changed circumstances, right? The health order changed, whatever. But at least you'd have that language that you could fall back on if there was any question about why you implemented something without negotiating it. You say, well, look, we had a trigger language. We gave you notice, and we moved, and that was it. So that would be the flexibility that I'm talking about. That would be great to have. Is it going to 100% be possible to do? Not every situation, not with every unit, but maybe if you've got a great relationship and a lot of trust, that may be something that you can do so you don't have to worry about it, right? And so there's ways to do this that make it a little more palatable and more efficient for you as well. So I forgot to put the questions and answers slide, but that's what I've got today, folks. So with that, I'd open it up to questions if anybody has any. And if not, I guess I'll let you go 15 minutes early. Any questions out there? Any burning questions, COVID related, bargaining related? I've answered everything. That never happens. Well, thanks again for joining me on a Monday morning. I hope that I gave you some food for thought and some tips and some answers to some questions that you might have had. I look forward to seeing you in the negotiations trainings that we're going to be putting on this year to get your bargaining teams ready and prepared to do the virtual back and forth of negotiations. And if not actual in-person negotiations, I'm actually headed out today to do that for the rest of my day. So with that, be safe out there. Have a great week, and I hope to see you soon at our negotiations trainings.
Thank you, Peter.
Take care now. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day. Thanks for being here.